So before we start, since we have a number of panelists that are from the NIH, we have a disclaimer that we have no conflict of interest, and that applies to all the NIH panelists, as well as Dr. Johnson from UCSF. So today we are going to cover a couple of topics. First, I'll do a brief introduction about music-based intervention. What's the premise? Why do we think that this is important and that this is actually going to be helpful? Then two of my colleagues are going to give you a summary of the state of the music and health research field. We'll follow up with what further research is needed and how we can get there. And then finally, we'll have a presentation where we're going to use cognitive behavioral therapy as a model for what other similar fields have, how they have actually achieved their path ahead. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Of course, I've already introduced myself. Dr. Julene Johnson is a faculty member at the University of California, San Francisco, and also a co-director of the Sound Health Network. Dr. Wen Chen is a branch chief of the Basic and Mechanistic Research at the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health at NIH. Dr. Laura Thomas is a program director at the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Dana Schloesser is a program director at the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the NIH. And finally, Dr. Alexander Talkovsky is also a program director at the National Institute of Mental Health at the NIH. So I wanted to let you, last night we've heard those wonderful performances and we were all really in awe of the beautiful singing and the music that we listened to. So today we wanted to actually talk a little more about the potential of actually tapping into these wonderful musical experiences in the context of health. Happy to let you know that the National Institute of Health has been funding a number of investigators to actually study how music can impact the brain and also can impact well-being and how we can actually exploit that potential for therapeutic benefits. So essentially, musical experience really can shape your brain, your cognitive development, can really impact on well-being and quality of life. But also, we're starting to realize that we can utilize music-based intervention to ameliorate symptoms of a number of disorders, particularly brain disorders of aging. And we're going to be talking about that a little more. Next slide. So when we talk about music-based intervention, we have to think in terms of what components of music could be involved in those interventions. So right now, we could actually talk about the melody, the harmony, and the rhythm. I have to say that currently, the research that we're funding, the majority of the researchers are focused on rhythm. And there is actually room for growth for looking at other components of music, harmony, melody. So if you're a researcher, that would be a gap area. Next. Next. Okay. Oh, no, sorry. Go back. So also, when we're talking about music-based intervention, we have to think about how, the music is being delivered. So you can think about this in the context of a receptive experience versus an active experience. And in a receptive experience, you could do this solo, meaning that you could be sitting listening to music, or you could do it as part of a group. Similarly, in an active situation, you could be part of a group performing, or you could actually be, developing a program as well. Next. So there is also other components that need to be, paid attention to. There's this issue of terminology that we need to address. So when you talk about music-based intervention, we have to distinguish whether it's music-based therapy, which is actually a situation where you have a client, the music, and a credentialed therapist actually working together toward a particular goal, as compared to other music-based intervention that we could call them music medicine, where the music is delivered by other professionals. It could be a nurse, it could be a clinical psychologist, it could be one of your graduate students in the lab. And we don't actually know very much about the difference between the impact of the two types of music-based intervention. So another gap area that we need to actually address. Some example of music-based intervention include singing or playing instruments, songwriting, improvising that we heard very much last night, and music movement. A lot of time people ask us, aren't you interested in dance? And in a way we are, because music and movement are interrelated. Next. So the promise of music intervention is that it's really a low cost, it's not an invasive method, it also is well accepted. So the promise is that it could be applicable to multiple settings. It could be in clinics, it could be in home care settings, it could be in outpatient care, and it could be very helpful in the context of prevention and health promotion. In order to get there, though, we're going to have to get through a number of hurdles, including more acceptance from the regular medical profession, and also the potential of having this reimbursed more equally by a number of payers. Next slide. Another area of interest is to really understand the neural circuits that are involved in music-based intervention. So when you listen to music or you perform music, typically the first areas that actually is activated is the auditory cortex. However, the auditory cortex does not live in a vacuum. It's really connected to multiple areas of the brain. So for example, the auditory cortex is connected to the motor system, and that has been really utilized in terms of interventions that are focused on improving the gait of Parkinson's patients. It's also, the auditory pathway is connected to the cognitive system, and this is being used for Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Auditory pathway involved in the affective and motivational system. Hence, music intervention can be used to relieve stress and anxiety and some mild aspect of depression. And of course, other sensory systems are involved as well. So cardiovascular disease and pain can also be utilized in trying music-based interventions. Having said that, I am actually going to turn the podium to my colleague, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Chen. They are going to tell you about what's happening in the state of the field. Julene?
Thank you very much, Dr. Edwards, and I'm really honored to be here and share this panel and the thoughts on the panel, so thank you very much. My name is Julene Johnson, and I'm a professor at the University of California, San Francisco. I have the honor also of being the co-director along with Dr. Charles Lim of the Sound Health Network. So I'm very happy to be here to give you a quick snapshot of where the current state of the research is in less than 10 minutes. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. So currently, there are no systematic reviews or meta-analyses about all the studies that have been done related to music and health. So that's a big gap. However, our colleague, Dr. Sherry Robb, did a systematic review in 2018 where she looked at the reporting quality of the music-based intervention research in healthcare. And what I've done with that is I've used that as a proxy to help establish next slide, please. The number of articles that have been published in addition to the reviews. So if you look on the left side here, you'll see that in 2018, Dr. Robb and colleagues reported that there are approximately 1,300 articles related to the benefits of music-based interventions, which also included 190 reviews. And this spanned about 20 years, from 1998 to 2018. Now, fast forward, Jessica McLean and Dr. Sherry Robb, Jessica is a doctoral student, are working on an update which cover the last 5 years of research related to examining the benefits of music-based interventions. And as you can see here, we now have an additional 523 articles to represent almost 1,800 articles, but also we have additional reviews too. So as you can see, this field is growing rapidly. So if there's a student out there who wants to think about a systematic review related to that, this would be really a great project. Next slide. So as a proxy, because we don't have a comprehensive review out there at this point, I turned to the Cochrane Libraries, which is kind of the gold standard for summarizing systematic reviews related to health and healthcare outcomes. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that when I queried the Cochrane reviews, there were 65 articles systematic reviews that included music as one of the aspects of that review. However, there were 16 in particular that focused on music, and by this I mean that music was an element, a strategic element in that music-based intervention. And this included 267 trials and over 16,000 participants. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the types of conditions and symptoms that were addressed in these 16 systematic reviews, and I'm not going to read them all. But importantly, these took place over the last 20 years. And under the lower line, you can also see the types of music interventions, such as music therapy that was delivered by a credentialed music therapist, singing, auditory integration therapy, etc. But I think you can get a snapshot of the type of conditions that there have been enough research that has looked at the benefit of music in health. The next slide is to quickly give you a sense of the type of outcomes that have been studied. And I won't read these, I'll let you kind of take it in, but essentially the message is the same, which is there a varied number of outcomes, kind of the psychological, behavioral, cognitive, physical, spanning also the social and physiological, etc. And finally, I want to close with this last slide here to think about what is the strength of the evidence that we have. And although there's not one exact way to depression, gait in the context of stroke, insomnia, and cancer, and in particular, if we look at cancer, you can see that there's strong evidence related to the benefits of music in helping alleviate or decrease anxiety, depression, and pain. And in the middle column are where there's evidence that's more moderate to low strength, and I'll just let you look at those. And finally, on the far right, in the yellow, you'll see the studies that we currently have insufficient evidence to support the benefit of music. And some of the reasons why we don't have a stronger evidence base for this might be because of the smaller sample sizes. There might be unclear allocation of participants into the various arms of the studies. Sometimes the blinding of the assessors is not systematically done. There might be missing data or incomplete data. And oftentimes the protocol for the music-based intervention and the study protocol are missing. So these are some opportunities to improve the quality of the studies, but hopefully you can kind of get a very quick snapshot. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Chen.
All right, thank you, Dr. Johnson, for that very nice introduction about the potential therapeutic effects of music-based interventions on a variety of health conditions. I'm going to be actually going to the opposite end of the scope, and I'm going to zoom in into one of the conditions and sort of trying to showcase you a bit about the current literature that look at how music-based interventions might exert its effect for a particular condition such as pain, right? So as you have seen the slide from Dr. Edwards earlier, this is the brain circuitry, a potential brain circuitry connected to the auditory system that might be underlying the effects exerted by music-based interventions. I wanted to highlight on this particular one on the left-hand corner. Okay, it would be a right-hand corner. It's a little hard for me to figure out which side it is. So that this is a potential pathway for how music-based intervention may go through the auditory system and then connect to the pain pathways, which is a sensory pathway to execute its potential therapeutic effect. I actually, rather than doing going into systematic review, which I wasn't capable of doing by myself. So I just went to PubMed, just did a hand count of publications. So my search criteria was really looking at the RC randomized clinical trials, have the search terms of music and pain, and I sort of went through, and then I focused on the last 4 years a little bit because I thought that's a very nice bifurcation, because that's when we actually see a pretty nice doubling of publications in the area of music and pain post to the famous 2013 workshop on music and brain that was held at the NIH and co-sponsored by the Kennedy Center and the National Endowment of Art. So actually, I literally read every single one of those papers and then trying to see what is the positive and negative effect as reviewed by those studies. And the green columns here is really to show the effects of some sort of music-based intervention on the pain. Either it's acute pain, meaning you just get injury and you're trying to recover. A very famous example is pain you have during giving birth. And then there are others, such as pain experienced during procedures or pain during chemotherapy or other medical conditions. So that's a little more chronic condition. And altogether, it seems that you could see a lot more numbers under the green columns, meaning it does have a pain relieving effect, a lot less numbers in the no effect or maybe even a little bit negative effect column. So overall, it does seem like at the randomized clinical trial level of studies, there's pretty strong predominant evidence supporting its effect on pain, which is consistent with what Dr. Johnson just mentioned, that it does fall into the strong to moderate effects or moderate level of evidence here. But then I looked into a little bit more about, so how many of those studies, or how many studies are actually looking at how music-based intervention lead to the pain relief or associate with pain relief, what we call the mechanism questions. And there were actually really few. Very few of them are actually looking at exactly how it might work or even just in our brain what's happening. So that really leads to us to realize that there's quite a bit of challenge on how we're going to understand the effect of music on even just one type of medical condition, such as pain relief. And this kind of, and we really found maybe the challenge is a multitude of issues. First of all, we don't really quite have a very nice framework to guide the research, development of research questions. We also don't have quite consistent terminologies. I was reading all those papers, and they call it everything, singing and the very different terminology, very different sort of definition as well. So that was challenging. And I also they're somewhat narrowly scoped, meaning that it's hard to build collaborations within this emerging field or bring other scientists from other disciplines to come in to work with you. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are very few mechanistic studies to look at how it might work, and very, very few animal model studies. I might regret of this one box in the next few slides. And also, it doesn't have a very strong mechanistic measures, like how are we going to measure the responses in the brain or in the body to music-based intervention, or how do we even measure music-based intervention itself consistently? And lastly, we don't have a biomarker to sort of follow to see, okay, can we predict treatment response or not? So there's a whole host of challenges for this field to overcome. And some of our proposed, in the current literature, in the mechanistic realm of studies, there are some attempts, not necessarily on pain per se, but in other conditions that mentioned by Dr. Johnson a little bit, and Dr. Edwards as well. There are several ways you can study music-based intervention. It could be studied in what we call model systems beyond ourselves, human beings. It could be, and you've heard in the last few days and in prior meetings that it could be very nicely studied in birds, for instance, and it could be rodent models actually, you know, the rats and mice are actually potentially really nice model too. And then obviously non-human primates that are very close to us could be used for studying music-based interventions, and then ourselves as a model system as well. And then there are many different technologies that have been and will continue, hopefully, to support our mechanistic study, in particular in humans. This includes sort of a non-invasive brain imaging technology such as MEG or EEG. There's a functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional MRI, and then transcranial magnetic stimulation that you can really stimulate the brain activities in human more or less non-invasively. And very neatly, there's a motion capture technology nowadays. I think people use that in Hollywood movie production quite a bit, but I think it could be very nicely used for music-based interventions, in particular for those studies that are involving musician performing instruments or in a sort of orchestra setting or dance type of interventions. So those are many different ways people can use. In the next two slides, I'm going to give you very specific two papers or sort of a very summary of two studies that actually, one uses the model system in rodents to actually explore how music or sound-based intervention may relieve pain, and the other one will be looking at the brain circuitry involved in humans. Okay, so this one is actually a very cool study that was just published a couple of months ago in Science magazine. It's looking at the neural-circuitry underlying sound-induced analgesia in rodent models. This diagram, without going into a lot of details, what it's really trying to show is that a particular range, low intensity of sound beyond the ambient noise, but not very high intensity, has specifically induced a very robust analgesia, meaning pain relief. And that's indicated by this, let me see if I can. Oh, I can do this. Okay, by the blue line here, the orange and the black lines are sort of what we call controls. No sound, ambient sound or very high intensity sound, both don't work, but that very nice moderate sound quality works. And maybe it sounds like a music tune in the mice, and that's sort of the connection to, to music here. But what's really cool about this study is that they then went on to do very, very sophisticated in vivo neuroimaging study. They open a little window in the mouse head to look into exactly the neuronal firings and control very specific neuronal connections, activities in those mice brain to try to identify precise neurocircuitry that's being involved in delivering this analgesia effect. And in particular, they identified two brain circuitry right here highlighted. Those two particular connections, what they show is if you wipe them out or if you stimulate them, they will either block the pain relieving effect or they actually replicate the pain relieving effect of the sound, so which is a very cool study. And this is a nice summary diagram to show the potential pathways, neural pathways involved in how brain is processing sound and music to deliver the pain effect. Relieving effect. this, I guess what color is coming out too? It's like a blue. This is the traditional pain neural pathways that's being identified by the pain field. And then this red pathway, solid red, is what's being actually illustrated in this paper to show the pathways, in particular, this auditory to thalamus, so to like a middle of the brain. That connection is the most unique finding here for this study as the new neural circuits involved in delivering the pain relieving effect in the brain. And there are other those dotted red lines are potential future connections for people to test and study. So this is a very neat study to show how you can use animal models to help us to unravel the circuitry involved in the brain for music-based interventions. And this neuroimaging study that was published a couple of years ago actually is very nice dovetail confirmation, but it happened before the animal model work. But it dovetails really well with this animal model work to show there are a wide range of brain circuitry, brain areas that are activated by music, and in fibromyalgia patient who have a lot of pain all over the body. And they, in this particular study, they identified 34 brain regions that are being activated. And those 34 brain regions are actually fall into what we commonly consider as the pain matrix in the brain. So that's pretty neat indication of how music may exert the effect. And when this is coupled, this kind of studies coupled with animal models, that give us really strong evidence of how music-based intervention might work in the brain, in particular for pain. And obviously, I think what we really need to do is to do a lot more of this type of studies, extending beyond just pain, but also into other conditions that Dr. Johnson, Dr. Edwards mentioned earlier, and also beyond the rodent models, maybe using different type of models. And that's where I'm going to stop. Regarding the current literature study about the mechanism part of the music-based intervention, I'm going to pass the control to Dr. Laura Thomas and then to Dr. Dana Schloesser, who will tell you a little bit more about, given the current state, what NIH has done in the past, current, and in the future about supporting this area of research. Oh, I don't need to.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to kind of change tracks for a couple minutes and talk about how this all got started. How is it that the NIH, the Kennedy Center, and the NEA are all on the same ticket? And as you heard last night, a now infamous dinner party where Renée Fleming and our beloved former director, NIH director, Dr. Francis Collins, were at, and they were singing after dinner and had a conversation about music and medicine. And luckily, they let us in on that conversation and expanded it. And just a few months later, we had a workshop at the NIH where we called Music and the Brain, Research Across the Lifespan. And this, again, brought together these kind of power trio of the music and health, the Kennedy Center, the NEA, and the NIH, as well as we had musical therapy professionals and advocacy groups and clinicians, and had a lot of collaboration and crosstalk across these disciplines by professionals who don't usually talk to each other to figure out where is it that the field should go. It focused primarily on basic and mechanistic ways that music affects the brain, as well as on music and healing. And from this workshop, we published an article in Neuron about a year later on music in the brain. And from this article, the primary outcome, summary, most important, was this table that summarized the findings from this workshop about where holes in the field, where should the field go. And from this, the then director, Dr. Francis Collins, called for the formation of a trans NIH, meaning across the NIH's 27 institutes and centers, having representation from multiple institutes on a working group focused specifically on music and health for the first time. And the charge of this working group was to develop and implement a research agenda that encompassed both basic and applied research. And ideally, we wanted to have partnerships with musicians, clinicians, and scientists, hence this trio of institutions that you see collaborating here today. And our three leaders of this working group, Dr. Edwards, who we heard from, Bob Finkelstein, who is in the audience, and Dr. Chom Cheever, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, who have all been instrumental, just pun noted, in moving us forward and, and tackling the formation of RFAs, or requests for applications, that the NIH put out that are focused on the basic and mechanistic research, as well as translational and clinical research on music and health. So we had 3 of these calls for grant applications that came out, and in 2019, the NIH awarded 15 grants that were focused on music and health. And then we have since, in fiscal year 2020, we republished these as program announcements, and from these we have awarded 7 more grants. So the majority of these grants are investigating the use of music to help heal in various domains, as well as looking at the neuroscience and processing of music in the brain, because if we can understand the mechanism of music in the brain, that can help harness its healing power. And so we see this in these examples with multiple populations, from healthy people across the lifespan, developmental approaches, to looking at people recovering from stroke and Parkinson's, chronic pain, and psychiatric illnesses, as well as some animal models, as was mentioned previously. And we have, I think, at least 3 or 4 grantees in the audience, which is really cool to see. So, yeah, congrats to them. And so the NIH is continuing on. We had, our fearless leader, Dr. Collins, has set us off on a running start, and we are continuing forward. And I will pass it along.
Great, thank you, Laura. I will go ahead and continue on with talking about what are the future directions. How are we going to sustain this growth of this very emerging field, or at least emerging from our NIH standards. So the 2 things that I'm really going to talk about are these this toolkit, NIH Music-Based Intervention Toolkit, and then also the research network. You notice this is the same graph, the table from the previous Neuron publication. So these 2 activities were focused on building up or addressing the methods and outcomes issues that were brought up in the earlier meeting, as well as capacity building and infrastructure. So we talked about the toolkit. The toolkit basically came up with as a part of 3 separate meetings that had different objectives. The first one I have shown up here was basically laying the foundations. So focusing on the creation of a toolkit with a consolidated set of common data elements for music-based interventions. And then the next one was identifying the most feasible and relevant functional outcome measures in domains relevant to brain disorders of aging. And let me back up and say this toolkit is more focused on diseases of the brain of aging. Diseases and disorders. The third one was focused more on identifying and cataloging a set of reliable, broadly accessible biomarkers in order to objectively and quantitatively monitor the responses to the brain and other physiological systems to music-based interventions in clinical studies. Yes, and so this whole core of data set of biomarkers, the intention is that this is what would be used in future NIH funded interventions. So these culminated up into a manuscript, which is currently under review right now in neurology of NIH music-based intervention toolkit. So that should be coming out to the internet near you, somewhere, PubMed. So on with that, we talked about, the last thing I'm going to talk about more is this capacity building. So the idea is having a research network of music and health, which would be a collection of networks that each one could focus on specific health conditions. So these examples, you've heard Wen talk about pain. You also heard some talk about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and strokes. These are just examples. So the networks, they could each focus on specific health conditions, but come together in order to work on common topics that needed to be tackled across all music interventions, such as terminology, taxonomy. I think we've heard Wen talk about how the terminology was all over the place. So getting this common language would be one idea that the network could tackle. So this is just showing basically a little bit closer up that same target of the objectives of a research network. And again, it's promoting this multidimensional research and building up the training and infrastructure that will be needed for the next generation of music research or music intervention researchers. So what activities would these research networks actually do or support? So they would, first off, they would support meetings and conferences, collaborations, exchanges, and training. And additionally, they would support or provide funding for pilot projects. Once these pilot projects take off, then the data from these could be used by the researchers to pursue other grant opportunities for more funding. And additionally, they would work with having publishing with publication and dissemination and outreach. And this would work with all of the investigators in the network. So the high priority topics for the research networks, when we're talking about the music interventions, there's targets and biomarkers and technologies and tools. So as far as with the interventions, you're just really wanting to define and differentiate different types of interventions and the various components. In addition, like I mentioned before, looking at the mechanisms and especially biomarkers that are important in music-based interventions, as well as developing of the novel tools and technologies for music-based interventions. So these are three very big, broad things that the research network could tackle, and we would prefer if they did, of course. So with that very brief talk on mine about future directions, we would like to hear from Alex more about what has happened in other fields of intervention and the path forward that maybe is suggested for, or a potential path forward for music-based interventions.
Thank you. So I'm Alex Talkovsky. I'm a program officer in the Division of Translational Research at the National Institute of Mental Health, particularly the mood and anxiety disorders programs. I take a lot of our clinical trials. So I'll be talking a little bit about the path that CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy took to become a gold standard, and offer that as an example that music therapy itself could use. So I'll talk a little bit about its relationship with insurance, the background of CBT itself, and then offer some of the resources we at the federal government use that could be of service to you if you're interested in clinical research or just interpreting more of the body of research that's out there too. So let's look at CBT's relationship with insurance to start. So this is from a memo from the HHS press office. It's a release about the 2022 Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act to Congress. And according to the report, health plans and health insurance issuers fail to ensure parity between medical and mental health. So we can surmise from it. I hit that on my computer, but not on your screen. My apologies. But I don't think you'll be reading the entire report anyway, let's be honest. We can surmise from it, among other things, that the burden of proof for third-party payers to cover psychiatric and substance abuse services is high. CBT is one of those services that insurance covers, but often with limitations. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about how it got to that point. This is a section of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts' website outlining their mental health coverage. They do not cover acupuncture, tai chi, massage, or other complementary services, but they offer reimbursement or discounts for what they call holistic health. These are some of the more studied complementary treatments, so this may be an acknowledgement that their research bases are growing. It's also an acknowledgement that insurance companies may see room for alternative services to improve behavioral health beyond psychotherapy, if they think those services can be effective and improve a person's overall health to reduce the insurer's overall costs. So let's look at the CBT a little bit now. And of course, I'm being very brief with everything. Our time is limited, but I'd be happy to answer more questions later or encourage you to start to dive into some of these topics yourself with this serving as your background. So CBT is the brainchild of Aaron Beck from his psychiatry practice in the 1960s, working with his patients with depression. He noticed a pattern of negative beliefs and thoughts among patients and designed a psychotherapy based on his clinical observations, what would ultimately become his cognitive model. Cognitive and behavioral models were not new. He had predecessors, and he built on their previous work, as good science so often does. In fact, his cognitive model actually came after he failed to confirm psychodynamic models in his practice. But he still didn't abandon psychodynamic models until his cognitive model became more fleshed out. He even held psychodynamic theories into the 1970s, well after the first cognitive model. Beck's contemporary, Albert Ellis, also put forward a behavioral model that gained traction and even continues to affect clinical practice today, including in a treatment called cognitive processing therapy for PTSD, which is also considered a gold standard treatment. But why did Beck's model gain so much more traction? Ellis actually still has more research citations than Beck. What we would now call CBT is actually an integration of many different intellectual roots. Using PTSD treatments as an example again, whether they'd be more of a top-down cognitive treatment like CBT that I just mentioned, or more of a bottom-up behavioral treatment like prolonged exposure, the term CBT can mean a lot of different things. However, they do share those theoretical underpinnings. Nevertheless, despite the kind of amalgam of intellectual roots that CBT is today, Beck's model still continues to accumulate the strongest data. What does the strongest data mean? Over the decades, CBT became the gold standard psychotherapy, and you probably wonder how it got there. I sound like a bad 90s movie when I say that, but it's a valid question. A key factor is the ever-growing body of research supporting it. CBT tends to outperform other psychotherapies in meeting the definition of empirically supported therapy, whether by a body like the American Psychological Association or someone else. So that relates not just to the quantity of research, but also its quality. CBT trials are more likely than trials of other treatments to be of high quality due to use of design aspects like strong control groups or quality randomization. CBT was also at the forefront of psychosocial treatments in adopting the evidence-based framework inspired by the model of big pharma research. So that then forced those that followed to use CBT as their reference group, making it difficult to demonstrate incremental improvement above CBT. It also has a deep research base on cognitive and behavioral models, or conceptual models, and potential mechanisms of change. We've heard the words mechanisms and targets a lot today. Those continue to be vital. Beck's experience, even with his cognitive model, was bottom-up to an extent. He observed the common element in clinic and used it as a foundation for his model. And since then, it's intersected across a number of different sciences: cognitive neuroscience, neurobiology, affective science, and more. A lot of the research now inquires into its underlying factors. Critics say there's a lack of conclusive results, but that's as much because psychotherapy is multifactorial and doesn't necessarily lend itself easily to such an analysis as a biological treatment would with a single substrate it's targeting. Because CBT has this strong evidence base, it also serves as a reference group in clinical trial of other treatments, and it's difficult to outperform CBT, and the results are likely to be incremental, if significant at all. The alternative is to demonstrate that the treatments act through different mechanisms to establish a new treatment's utility through an experimental medicine perspective, which I'll define for us in just a moment. But other domains often do not do quality mechanistic research like we see in examples of already here today. So the article that I have up here on the slide provides a recent opinion piece about the rigor of CBT, and its authorship includes not only a CBT expert, but somebody, then the senior author whose psychotherapy has even moved beyond CBT into some of the newer waves of psychotherapy, widening his perspective a bit, and he still comes back to the rigor of CBT research. As I discussed, Aaron Beck and the others at the forefront of the cognitive behavioral treatment wave had theory to draw from Skinner to Watson and even Freud. And they built on models, and even beneath the obvious surface, their models were influenced by their medical training, because even these psychotherapies that psychologists like me use come from psychiatrists. Insurance companies are invested in minimizing their costs, requiring things like a diagnosis and treatment plan to cover services. And CBT, in its structure and encouragement of assessment and thorough case conceptualization and early treatment, tends to fit in pretty well with the models they like. CBT, it's directed and it's time limited, so insurance companies often know that they're not going to be paying in perpetuity for mental health services. There's also a lot of opportunities for licensed professionals to pursue continuing education and certification to demonstrate their qualifications. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, to offer an opposing example, tends to be more open-ended, making it tougher for insurance companies to support. So the structure and planning of CBT tends to match what insurance companies want, helping to get their support and in turn putting the money behind it. And for the last section, I'll just direct us to some of the resources that the federal government offers to help guide anybody who may be interested in learning more about what goes into the strongest clinical research studies. This is straight from the NIMH website describing what we call the experimental therapeutics model. You can see from the description that we emphasize mechanism and theory with engagement of a putative target taking priority in treatment development. Historically, proposals of mediators came much later in treatment development, but we know now that common factors and the placebo effect can lead to statistically significant results if the sample size is just large enough. So we want treatments to give us an idea of how they work and who they might work for from their inception. Also, the standard of rigorous evaluation has risen over time. Waitlist controls don't really cut it anymore, so either the treatment has to provide a better outcome than a current system of care, or provide an alternative approach to treating the pathology as demonstrated by its target or mechanism. This is a potential pathway towards meeting common criteria for a strong evidence base, and a level of evidence on par with what's shown here is probably required to gain attention from a wider audience, such as new potential clinics or third-party payers. So for additional information about methodological rigor in clinical trials, this is a sample from the NIH website detailing the definition and requirements of clinical trials research. There are idiosyncrasies across institutes, but those are mostly scientific rather than administrative, with some exceptions. Even reading about the requirements can teach about how NIH thinks of clinical trials and important elements of a good clinical study. We at NIMH have our own too, but I'd actually recommend starting with the wider NIH site to see the generalities before going to a specific institute and hearing more about their specific approach. This is from our sister site over at FDA. It's their information about the drug and device development process, but it does offer a good analogy for the clinical trial and therapeutics development pipeline. They offer information about clinical trial design, going slightly beyond what they would require for approval. You can see that the arrows, I apologize, that text up there is a little small, but they show that clinical research is actually the third step behind target discovery and development and preclinical research. That should probably sound familiar by now. And the stages of research are different, but they highlight the important components of clinical research, such as the need to evaluate dosage in intervention research. So to wrap up, with insurance and governmental stakeholders, the burden is pretty high to be considered an evidence-based treatment. Requires a large quantity of strong research. CBT and related research commonly meets the criteria for strong research, so it's one of the easier treatments for stakeholders to support. With that support, it becomes easier for people to put money behind it, whether funding agencies or insurance payers. And to be reductive, just to be quick in wrapping us up, to get on CBT's level requires a pretty large accumulation of research across the research pipeline from target discovery all the way out to implementation science. And at the era of personalized medicine, people want to know if there's a target factor important to illness and if that treatment can hit it and what that would mean for clinical care. So being able to target all those factors could lead to wider acceptance and a lot more money going behind it, which is what I know we all want. So that's my last slide, and I will, sorry, that was a summary. Well, hopefully I did a good enough job talking about it for you. So I guess that leads, we will open for questions.
Yeah. So don't be shy. I'm sure you have questions. We'd be happy to answer them. So I'll say at the beginning, I mentioned blue sky idea. What we would like really to see is that down the line, that music-based intervention are fully integrated into healthcare systems, and that the concept of social prescription takes hold in the US as it has in other countries. There's a question down there? Yes. Oh. So what we would really like to see, this is my perspective, and I'll let the other panelists comment, is that we would have established multiple research networks composed of interdisciplinary researchers that would be tackling various research gaps that we identified, so that they can actually develop research programs that would help us answer some of the questions that are still, pending. And we thought that strong evidence base, we are somewhat hampering ourselves in the context of fully being able to demonstrate the value added of music-based intervention. So that's our primary goal, is to strengthen the evidence, and that would lead us to integration into healthcare. Anyone else, if you...
Maybe I'll just chime in a little bit more to expand on what Dr. Edwards just said. I think 5 years from now, what would be really wonderful, I think we now have pretty much at the edge of covering all the initial recommendations, what we should be accomplished in order to support the initial growth of the field, with the research networks, which will help to bring people from many different disciplines together, to work together, help them to meet each other, establish a relationship and work together, and then build very preliminary work that will help them to be very competitive at the NIH for the sort of traditional NIH funding mechanisms. And that will help them to build the type of rigorous research evidence, as we just heard from Alex regarding what was required for CBT to be really successful. And we're hoping we can start to build that kind of evidence base to support the establishment of music-based interventions to be a therapeutic choice.
If I could add one more point about CBT, even now, with the medical model predominating clinical care, with the large body of research that CBT even has, it's still not universally accepted. There's still the stigma around psychological care let alone mental health care more broadly. We even get kind of that additional layer of stigma from not having the degree of mechanistic research that, say, medical research does. So even with that strong success over 5 years, it really is kind of a constant process that even the CBT world that I live in continues to go through. So it's all about those key benchmarks and milestones along the road.
There's a question there. You may have answered my question. Would we, or should we follow what CBT had done and follow their whole path to getting money and research? Just follow their plan, whatever we're studying? Or no? Did you say no?
I think we are following it, but they had, it was 1960s, is that when it started?
Yeah,
I mean, they
1960s.
had 60 years. You're giving us 5, so we're trying to see if we can. So we'll see if we can do something a little bit faster, but I don't know if we get there in the next 5 years, but hopefully we'll start to build the evidence.
Well, I can offer another comparison. So with some of the changes that NIMH specifically has undergone just in the past decade, even the CBT world has kind of gone into a degree of upheaval. So, like I said, it's kind of an ongoing process, and I don't even think the same path that CBT followed exists anymore. It's constantly changing. But falling into some of the same plans that they have now, the CBT world has now, is probably a good idea, because we still have to fit in with the experimental therapeutics model at NIMH, just, with my division director being a psychiatrist, our institute director being a psychiatrist, and me being a clinical psychologist who specializes in CBT and probably knew about 25% of the words that Dr. Chen put up on her slides about neurocircuits. So each can follow their own path with some common elements.
I'll just add a little more optimistic perspective, is that recently the NIH has been working more closely with CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And in fact, some of the listing that you had on your slide, Alex, acupuncture was one of them. Currently, CMS is covering acupuncture treatment in older adults that have chronic pain. So by NIH working closely with other federal agencies, I think there is an opportunity to actually improve the picture. So maybe we won't need 60 years. But, so it's a little more positive.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, just 2 seconds, is that I think what you're hearing here is that the more evidence we have, the more rigorous research, the better, especially if we can show that, one, music-based interventions don't have the same side effects as pharmacotherapies. We know that they don't. And if they're just as beneficial, and the big key thing is money. So getting the research that actually helps to demonstrate the usefulness and these positive benefits that go beyond just the treatment itself will be very helpful.
Yeah, I hope a comment, not a question, is allowed. From the National Endowment for the Arts, just wanted to point out that just as we've talked about clinical randomized controlled trials being the gold standard, NIH is really the gold standard for biomedical and behavioral research. But there's also a continuum of research where you can have pilot studies, mixed method studies, qualitative research. It's enormously important that NIH does support, but also other federal agencies do, like the NEA and even National Science Foundation and others. So one need not get hung up on, obviously we all want payment for this, but to not get hung up on the CBT model or something like that, but to look lower down in the continuum for other questions of who's benefiting from the actual studies and characterizing the patient populations better. All kinds of studies that can be done. So definitely more and more rigorous research, but there's seems to be a broader continuum.
So this could be the last question. We were asked to wrap up. Go ahead.
I'm curious, you mentioned in this process that there's a desire to partner with other artists, with music therapists in particular. I work in the performing arts sector, and most performing arts organizations don't work with music therapists at all. And I'm curious if there's an effort or any momentum towards helping or encouraging performing arts organizations to partner with music therapists to help reduce that gap.
So I can quickly answer that. So the Sound Health Network has that exact goal this year during our tiers of stakeholders, and we're focusing on, broadly speaking, musicians, music educators. We're bringing our music therapists from our focus on year 2 into that mix. So please get engaged with the Sound Health Network. You can go to the website, sign up for a newsletter, get a directory entry, and participate in our social media and our events. So thank you for that question. Perfect.
So before we leave, though, I would like to acknowledge the Renée Fleming Foundation for helping us put in those 3 workshops together. And the development of that toolkit. So thank you, Renée. So thank you very much for attending and for your wonderful questions. I think that's it. We're done for this afternoon.